The BSides DC 2017 videos are brought to you by Threat Quotient, introducing the industry's first threat intelligence platform designed to enable threat operations and management, and Data Tribe, a new kind of startup studio co-building the next generation of commercial cybersecurity, analytics, and big data product companies.
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. My name is Tim Mather. I work with a startup in Silicon Valley called PatternX that does artificial intelligence and applying that to machine learning. I'm a security guy, a longtime security guy. Unfortunately, my partner, who is the data scientist, a true data scientist, a PhD from MIT, got called away. He was not able to fly here from Madrid because of an urgent, good for us, but bad for you, an urgent customer requirement that's due on Monday. So that kind of bumped into this. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. Encourage your questions. I don't have a clicker, so I'm stuck here behind the podium. And this isn't working. I'm frozen.
Today, I'm going to go over what my attack model is. I'm going to talk about the tools and then I'll tell you about the
Okay, that'll work. Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm stuck with this. Maybe we should just hold this. What's that? Okay. So problems today, what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? And that is the fact that, as I think all of you are aware, I'm making an assumption that all of you are security folks in here, is that we're trying to deal with actually detecting threats. We're not doing a very good job of that today in our models, and so what we're trying to do again is apply AI so we can do this on a much more flexible basis. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have some sort of SIEM deployed or using an MSSP to do that on your behalf. We'd like to be able to intercept this as far left on the kill chain as possible. Unfortunately, that's not working out very well. The fact of the matter is that we have way too many false positives. We have way too many false negatives. All you have to do is read the paper every week and see how many companies are getting breached off of that. And all of this is taking a very high demand in resources to actually investigate these incidents. So is there a better way to do this? What we are doing now with our models is we want to be able to detect at multiple stages in the kill chain. And so we're able to do this at the moment on a couple of different stages of this using artificial intelligence and modeling to do that. So we're able to do it for delivery, for command and control, and for exfiltration off of that. We use something called entities, and entities can be, for example, source IP address, destination IP address, it can be the domain, the user, it can be the application, etc. And so we're using those entities, and I'll explain that in just a minute, with various features in those entities, and then we build pipelines into that to be able to do the modeling. And I'm going to go into this in some detail here in just a moment. Very importantly, we're using analysts, we're using people in the loop to speed up the learning curve off of this. And then what we want to do, of course, is it's not nearly enough to tell me that a system has detected a problem. How do you actually do something about remediating that problem? So we want to be able to at least facilitate the response. We're not doing the response ourselves, but with whatever product you have, whether that's Phantom, whoever that might be, a Yahoo, etc., we want to at least be able to facilitate that. And I think probably most of you are aware of the fact that there is now a standard for that called OpenC2, which is being managed by Oasis to do that, which is specifically designed for detection products to be able to talk to response products. So if you're looking at your log data, and you're probably only looking at a fraction of what it is that you're even logging, and what you're logging is probably a fraction of what you're actually generating off of that, you're probably looking at some combination of billions or even trillions of combinations per day. Okay? This is something that obviously no human, no group of humans can actually go through. So very, very few of those are bad, and you want to be able to quickly find those that are bad. And the problem is that we have today with that massive amount of data is that probably 99% of the analyst's time is actually spent chasing things that they don't really need to, but then again, they don't know that. And unfortunately, from third-party research, if you take the Verizon data breach report as an example, in the last report, 82% of the time, the attack data was actually there in the logs, but no one even found it. It wasn't until the breach was actually detected, and usually that was by an external party, not the company itself that was hacked, then that they forensically can go back and say, there's the data. Well, at that point, almost so what? Maybe that's good for forensics purposes, but it certainly didn't do anything to stop the breach to begin with. So how do we do this? Again, we're working with artificial intelligence models to actually get to something that is much higher fidelity for the analyst there. One of the types of modeling that we use is graph analysis, which actually then not only shows first-order connections between the entities, and I'll get more into the entities in just a moment, but actually allows us to find second and even third-order connections between those entities, which makes the investigation process far, far faster. That means there's a lot less work on behalf of the analyst to go through and do their investigations. So this isn't really easy. There's a lot of talk about AI, and even in the security space, just about every vendor today claims to be doing some sort of AI or machine learning. But as much noise, as much hype as there is around AI, it's a little different than other types of AI, meaning AI that's being employed in the InfoSec space is not exactly the same as AI in other spaces. So there's a lot of work that's been done on AI, for example, in facial recognition. Facebook in particular has the largest set of individual photos in the world off of that. And that's great because Facebook has this huge training set to work with. There's more than 20 large data sets that are available for facial recognition. Unfortunately, in the InfoSec space, outside of malware, when I'm talking about exploits, there are very, very few, if really almost none that are current, large-scale data sets containing dirty traffic to be able to model with. So this is a very difficult problem as far as availability of the data sets. As far as universality is concerned, it's very, very difficult, again, in information security to have data sets because you have probably hundreds of different products that are out there. If you take the versions of those products, if you take the versions of logs of those products, we're probably talking several thousand different formats that have to be worked with and tried to be modeled with. If you take faces, I can model that very easily because there's probably 4 different formats I have to work with. I've got PNG, I've got TIFF, I've got GIF, I've got JPEG, and so I can normalize those training sets very rapidly to work with. We don't have that luxury in information security. When it comes to labels, meaning I actually have determined what this is, I've determined that it's malicious or benign, and if it's malicious, I actually know what it is. Okay, there are large data sets that are available for malware, but when it comes to exploits, those simply don't exist. So it's very hard for us to get labels to work with. We have to generate them basically ourselves and working with our customers. On the photo side, I don't even need a human to do this. I can go have Amazon's Mechanical Turk go through and label this for me. So that's easy. And as far as static versus dynamic is concerned, the attacks, as you all are well aware, change on basically a daily basis. They are very, very dynamic. Okay? What does a cat's face look like? Doesn't change very often. Okay? So once I know what a cat looks like, or once I know what a person looks like, okay, it's pretty darn easy for me to then zero in and then actually recognize that specific object. Okay? We don't have that luxury currently right now in the InfoSec space. So here's an example of being able to find domains that are used for phishing delivery. Okay? So here's a simple one, and that's fine. But now, what happens if the bad guys change it? You go to virus total and you say, yep, that's fine, that's malicious. So the bad guys now go and change it, and it now looks like this. Thinking. So here's my original, and I just change it a little bit, and I change it a little bit, and I change it a little bit. Okay? Now, if I'm working with blacklists, for example, this is a game of whack-a-mole. Okay? You're never going to win But this is a perfect example of where machine learning through models can pick this up, because these are very subtle changes, but those changes are enough to throw off a blacklist, and you have to go through and then update that, or your vendor has to go through and update that, and you have to apply that on a daily basis. But from a machine learning perspective, this is trivial to do. This is quite easy. So what does this training process look like? Well, first of all, again, we have to acquire the data to begin with. We need a large set of dirty data to work with, and we need that on a constantly refreshed basis because, again, the attacks change on a regular basis. So what I do, I'm the security guy, and when I work with the data scientist guys, is I go through and point out, well, here's a type of attack. And then we say, okay, based on that type of attack, what are the sources where we would look for log data that might be able to reveal that type of attack? So we have to go through and do that and look at those different sources. That may be a firewall, that may be EDR on the endpoint, whatever it might be. So identify the type of product that is going to be a source for that information. We then have to go through and document what are the specific data elements in that source of information that we want to look at, and then have to go through and look at what are the different thresholds for that. Is it high? Is it low? Is it first? Is it last? What is it that that might be? And we then go through and say, okay, we're looking for that, and by the way, we're collecting all these different features out of that log data, and I'll get to more of that in just a moment. And then from those features, and more specifically the feature vectors, then we can use different types of AI models to go through and look for that type of attack, okay? And the important part here is we're not looking for a specific attack. Unlike, for example, we're not looking for a specific strain of malware or something. We're looking for a type of attack based on the model, the behavioral model that is associated with that attack. So what am I talking about here? Okay, so we work with entities, and you can think of an entity as these examples here. There's other ones, but let's start with some very basic ones. You have a source IP address, you have a destination IP address, you have a domain that is associated with that destination IP address, you have a user that is associated with the source IP address, you have an application that that specific user is working with, and then there's other ones that go along with it. So these are entities then that we are going to use to model in our pipeline. And we then go through and we say, okay, out of those sources that we're looking at for that different type of entity, we're looking for these various features that go along with that, okay? And these entities are used with these features, and we build them into pipelines, as we call them. This is an AI term, if you will. And so for this one, for the source IP, as an example, there's 32 different features that we are capturing out of that pipeline. Okay, so when we're talking about source IP, it's not just a number. We're looking at all these different attributes or features that go along with that. Now, some of those I care about as a security guy. When did it actually happen? When was the first time it happened? When was the last time it happened? What was the largest size? What was the smallest size? And there's a lot of these features that really don't mean anything to me as a security guy, but they're extremely important to the data scientists because that's how they build their models. Okay? What was the average size of this? What was the mean of that? What was the standard of that? So about half of those 32, again, probably don't mean anything to me as a security guy, but they mean everything to the data scientist so that they can go build the model then that looks for that type of attack. Okay, as a second example here, when it comes to a domain, okay, we don't just care about the domain name. Again, there's all these different types of features that go along with that. So we're capturing all kinds of data. And in this particular case, currently that's about 20 different features that we're looking at that are related to the domain. Probably about half I care about, probably half the data scientists care about so they can do their modeling. Okay, so as we go through this process, for us, we use something called active learning. There is unsupervised learning, there is supervised learning, and then active learning is a combination of the two. But we definitely want that human in the loop for two reasons. Number one is that human allows the model to be trained much faster. The human looks at the predictions that we make. based on our modeling that we've done with the features, and we turn that into what we call feature vectors, and we throw up a probability on that, and we say, is that benign? Is that malicious? What is that? And the analyst can look at that and say, yeah, that's benign. Or no, that's wrong. That's actually malicious. Or we say, we think this is malicious. And it may be, for example, an outlier. And we think it's malicious simply because it's an outlier. We haven't seen it very often. And the analyst can look at that and say, no, I know what that is. You know, on the last day of the month, we do this transfer to this entity. For example, it's payroll or something like that. And that's why you haven't seen it. Okay, and that's why you see it so infrequently. So it's really not an outlier. It really is benign instead of malicious. But that feedback from the analyst then allows us to train the model much faster than if we were expecting the model to learn only on its own in an unsupervised mode. So we will go through then based on the feedback from the analyst then, and we will adjust the model accordingly. So this active learning process that we have then is key for us to being able to generate accurate labels for what is that behavior. Is that behavior benign? Is that behavior malicious? If it's malicious, what type of attack is it? Okay? For those of you who might be familiar with MITRE and their work, they have an ontology called attack, in which they've laid this out, looking at part of the kill chain, in which they say, here's 10 different tactics, 10 different types of attacks. And they have techniques under that, and they say, here's the different ways that that tactic can be accomplished. And so we're using that ontology as a starting point for the model. Why? Well, because it's a third party. It's not just us as a vendor making this up. It's a trusted source from MITRE, who's done work for the US government for years, and it's pretty darn accurate. So we feed that into that, and we base our labels on the feedback provided by the analysts, and accordingly then label that into a classification that has some standardization. And that standardization becomes very important when it comes to the transfer learning, which I'll get to in just a minute. And by the way, questions are welcome at any time, please. You don't have to wait to get a beer to ask one. Okay, yes, please. You're raising your beer. Okay, good. Do you have one for me? I guess I have to wait then. Okay, so transfer learning itself is not new. This has been around for years, okay? I used to be at Symantec. All of the major anti-malware vendors have had so-called zoos for years. Dirty little secret, so to speak, is they actually share their samples between zoos and have for years off of this. If you look at Snort and its community rules, there's another example of transfer learning. Again, Snort has been around since like 1998, okay? So nothing new there. The ISACs were created in, actually, they were launched in 1999, but the presidential directive was signed the year before in 1998. The whole idea, how do you share that data, et cetera. Now, of course, we have, I don't know how many dozens and dozens of threat intelligence, threat feed vendors that are doing that. Okay, those are all examples of transfer learning that have existed within InfoSec for many years. So what's new now when we're doing this with AI is we are not sharing just, if you will, static rules. It's not that strain of malware. It's not a Snort rule for this type of attack on RPC or FPC or whatever the protocol is. It's, when it comes to threat intelligence, it's not this specific domain. It's not this specific IP address. No, we are sharing behavioral models, okay? This is a, if you will, more of a generic approach to this. This is a much more flexible approach. We don't care what the specific source IP address is, as an example. We don't care what the specific destination IP address is. What we care about is what's the behavioral model that goes along with that. And that's why we collect all the features from these different entities when we do that, because that allows us to build the model then, which actually then can be shared. So it's the models that we're sharing, not, if you will, static rules. The other thing that we're doing, which to date has not been done previously, is we're not sharing any private information. So when information is shared between the entities, we're not sharing what the source IP address is, we're not sharing the username, we're not sharing what the host name is. We don't need to share any of that. All we're sharing is what does that behavioral model look like. Okay? And for the ISACs, this has been, of course, a major problem for years, is the reluctance to share that information, certainly not publicly, but even privately, because much of that information that is shared is specific to that organization. So there's been a lot of reluctance to share that information. That's why it's a closed community off of that. We don't have to worry about that because we're not sharing anything that is private. All we're sharing is the model itself, which is generic. Okay. So what this transfer learning then allows us to do is we're addressing the silo problem. You can easily share information between organizations, and there's no threat, again, of private information being released. We're just sharing the labeled data and saying what that is. So this enables the analyst then to collaboratively train off of that and say, well, actually, I think that the model looks like this in my organization, et cetera. So the analyst can work on the models and not the data itself. And again, just importantly, there's no private data that needs to be exchanged. So that in itself is a big win. So we have 3 objectives here for doing this. One of them is we want better detection rates. We need to get that false negative rate way, way down. We want to be able to learn faster. That's why we have the human in the loop. That's why we're doing the active learning. And then we want to be able to detect attacks today, again, that are not being detected. Okay? There's attacks flying by that no one's even seen. So we want to move that slope up, make it steeper, and get to a higher constant level faster so we can detect that. We want to vastly improve on where we are today. Now, is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. And I'll give you an example of that in just a moment. But it is improvement on how we're doing things today. Okay, so we put all of this into a shared label repository. It looks like this. This means something to the models that we have. This may not mean something to the individuals, but quite honestly, at this point, we're not concerned that it means something to the individuals. It needs to make sense to the models instead. So we take this information and we upload it to a label server. And the label server is a collection point where we take all the different models then that have been seen and we aggregate them together. Now, that doesn't mean that every organization is going to accept every single label that's up there. It's just like snort rules. You're not going to download and install every single snort rule. No, you're going to filter that, you're going to tailor that rule set to what's applicable to your organization. What OSs are you using? What OSs are you not using? What protocols are you using? What protocols are you not using, etc. Well, we're going to do the same thing with the labels here. Okay? So it's likely that a label from the retail environment may not be applicable to financial services or vice versa. So we need a way to do that, and we're going to do that through a training set. And we're going to go through this process and be able to say, is this label applicable to this organization? Again, because that organization is not going to download every single label there. It's not applicable. Frankly, it just slows down the learning process. So we need a way to do some A/B testing, if you will, and say, does that work for you? Does that not work for you? We can label the label and say what industry sector it came from. Well, it's probably not. Let's start with labels that are already been vetted into your vertical, and we take it from there as far as the training SAC is concerned. Okay, we can easily share this data. It can be shared today over Stix, Taxi. That's no problem whatsoever. We just extend the JSON format with entity and with features at the bottom, and it's already there. So there's no change other than a slight change to the format of Stix to include the information that is specific to this new type of capability, but just use Stix and be able to share that. And many of you probably already are using Stix, and there's no change whatsoever to the underlying taxi protocol as far as the actual transport is concerned. So here's a quick experiment that we did. You can read the numbers there. We took 3 different organizations. We looked at it through January of June of this year. We ranked this. This was for a phishing model that we tried. We ranked it against then the Alexa top 10,000 off of that. Hopefully all of you know what Alexa is. The rankings for websites are concerned. And this is the number of phishing attempts that we've found and the number of phishing domains that we found. And by the way, those were found before they were accepted somewhere else. This lost some formatting off of that. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened here. This gives you some analysis of the data itself in terms of what we saw. Okay. Okay. Looked fine in Google Slides, but it didn't work here. So, we're using random forest, just happens to be one of the 4 different types of models that we're using off of this. There's numerous different libraries that exist out there to help train these sets off of that. R is quite popular. We happen to be using Skit off of that. Okay. So then, again, from the active learning part, we've got a number of different types of models on the left that we're using to do that. Depends upon what that is. We take the top several thousand events. We are able then to analyze those and come up with, well, really sort of what it is. And then, of course, most importantly, we're using the feedback from the analyst to say, is that prediction correct or is that prediction wrong? And then we track ourselves internally, because it's important for us, how good are our models? What is our own model's false positive rate? What is our own model's false negative rate? Because we need that information to improve the models ourselves, and frankly, the analysts may have missed some things themselves. I mean, they're only humans. So we need that sort of data to improve as well. Okay, here's an example then of an organization that is doing this on their own. Okay, and we're going through and doing the classifications. In this particular case, it's random forests. And here's a second organization that we're doing. We're not perfect, as I said. Not sure what happened here with the fall off in the last month with organization number 2 off of that. And that's them on their own. If we supplement that and say we're going to do this with active learning, you can see then that the curves are steeper and you get to a higher point at the end. So the transfer learning does work. Is it absolutely necessary? No, it's not absolutely necessary, but why not get there faster? And if you can use another organization's labels, their models, why not do that? So why not share that particular type of information? Now, when it comes to, in this particular case, obviously this was looking at phishing domains, what's interesting here is that if you look at what machine learning could find before blacklists, more than 90% was able to be found before the blacklists. Again, the blacklists, your threat intelligence feed, I'm not bashing them, I'm just saying that they're static, if you will, in the fact that it's based on static IP addresses, static domains, meaning I have to know the exact IP address, I have to know the exact domain. Those will change regularly, but I have to know exactly what that is, and then I update my blacklist accordingly. If there's a way to do this on a generic basis better, much faster, why not? Well, in this case, 90% of the time, the models can beat the blacklists. So this is a pretty strong indicator that the process actually works. Okay. One of the ways that we do it is we look at these different types of features off of this. You've got the val ratio, the digit ratio, the number of phishing names, other ratios, the TLD frequency, the domain length, et cetera, the consonant ratio. And all of these things can get factored into the model then to say, go look for something that has characteristics of these different types, and they fall within ranges that we see. Okay. In English, for example, the consonant ratio is fairly constant, the vowel ratio is fairly constant, et cetera. In French, it's slightly different, but it's fairly constant, et cetera, off of that. There are certain key words that show up repeatedly that are a pretty good clue that it's a phishing domain, download, free, that sort of thing. So factor that into there as well. Some of this can also be done using n-grams. Off of this. This is fairly common. Of course, not all the world speaks English, so you're going to have various foreign language libraries that can account for this. And then you have to account for the TLDs that have been internationalized now as well. So what is in English, of course, doesn't necessarily have any bearing on what's Cyrillic, what's Arabic, et cetera. So all of that needs to be accounted for, which is a lot of work, but that's where we are. So the results that we're seeing so far, it's early on, but this has been peer-reviewed through academic conferences, specifically at MIT and through IEEE, but the results so far are pretty good. It's not entirely positive, as you see. I mean, there are mistakes that are being made, but the machine learning is learning, and so that's good. If you're interested in this, there's a paper called AI2, which has been published, again, peer-reviewed. It's out of IEEE. You can read about that. These numbers are not just a marketing ploy, but these have been validated academically. We've got a lot of next steps to try and do. Again, there's progress that's been made, but we've got things that we need to do. We need to develop new techniques that we have. The phishing is very accurate that we've seen to date. Finding DGAs is very accurate, we've seen to date. Unfortunately now you see less use of DGAs as attackers are moving more towards common websites, if you will, platforms to do their C&C through them. Specifically through Twitter, as an example. Microsoft's TechNet has been used for that. Facebook has been used for that. Anywhere where there's open pages that can be written to. So the DGA is accurate, but unfortunately, I guess unfortunately for us, that the DGA use has actually been declining the last couple of years. And again, of course, we're working with logs. Doesn't need to be syslog, but that's the most common variety. Unfortunately for us, syslog is not syslog is not syslog. Every vendor seems to have their own slight variants of that, so that's difficult. But it can be DNS logs, it can be bro logs, but whatever the log format is. And then, of course, actually finding the most recent attacks is very difficult off of that. We think that we're doing a better job than some other sources off of that, but that's a constant challenge off of that. And there's other things that we're working on as well. It's all about labels. Is the traffic benign? Is the traffic malicious? If the traffic is malicious, what type of tactic, what type of technique is it? The more refined those labels are, the more accurate they are, and therefore the greater ability to actually share those with other organizations through transfer learning. But this is the key, this is the goal. Everything is about labels. And again, while labels exist fairly widely on the malware side of InfoSec, they are very, very thin on the exploit side. And that's really where we're focused on, is how do we find those labels on the exploit side? How do we bring down those false negatives? And that's all I have. So I'm happy to address any questions there, or you can go grab a beer. Yes, please.
So you were talking a lot about domain classification.
Yes.
Which actually I've done a lot of work in, but with the n-gram approach, are you doing so word segmentation of the domains followed by n-grams and then like TF-IDF or something?
I'm not sure what TF-IDF is.
Well, it's like you generate the counts, but of each word, so you pick a vocabulary size somehow, and then you weight the counts of the words in that vocabulary present in that particular training example, so the domain. You weight it by what's called the inverse document frequency.
That is one of the techniques that are applied. There's, as I mentioned on that one slide there, between constant ratio, vowel ratio, length, etc. There's a number of different techniques that are used to then say what is the probability that that domain is actually a phishing domain. One of the things that we want to get to as well then is to be able to do a real-time lookup against who is one of the registrars and say, so when was the domain actually registered? If the domain was registered yesterday, there's a pretty strong indicator, which is why we use the Alexa rankings there as well off of that, so to try and see, is this an established domain or not? So constantly trying to improve that model. Yes, please.
You do also correlate with other entities in your role, like
Yeah.
and
Oh yes, yes. The whole idea is to correlate across the different entities. So it's fine. You take the entity, and this is where the what we call the auto correlation comes in, and using the graph analysis to be able to find the second and the third order connections between those is across the different entities. So we're not looking just at the source IP pipeline, not looking just at the domain IP pipeline, not looking at just the destination, et cetera, on an individual basis. No, so we start within that pipeline and the different features within there, and then we correlate that against the other pipelines, and that's what gives us that model, that behavioral model then as a result of correlations across the different entities. Correct. Yes, please.
Have you encountered any interesting training difficulties distinguishing between attackers that are living off the land and like sysadmins?
So the question is, any difficulties in training environments, attackers living off the land versus sysadmins? Say a little bit more, please. Are you referring to external versus insider attacks?
Say using PowerShell and interesting.
PowerShell. So let's talk about that as an example. Obviously, PowerShell is being used fairly extensively these days for lateral movement. The problem with PowerShell is not necessarily what it's doing. The problem is actually getting the logs that do that can tell you what exactly is going on. Almost nobody actually has PowerShell logging turned on. So again, we're back to the problem that we have is actually finding large sources of data that log data that may contain that information. And PowerShell is high on the list that we'd love to get to, but almost no one's logging that data, so it's really hard to work with. Believe me, as a security guy, it's number one on my list. My ability to deliver that to my data scientist colleagues is pretty darn low right now, unfortunately. So, yes, please.
You mentioned people using Facebook or Twitter for phishing.
No, not for phishing, for command and control. Correct. So anywhere, any social media platform where I can write to various pages there. So in essence, I'm telling my compromised host, communicate with the CNC server. So I effectively I use Twitter as an example, or Facebook, or TechNet, anywhere where I can write to that. I'm going to call it social media platform. Microsoft's TechNet is not a social media platform, but I can post comments there. So any platform where I can do that, it's very hard for me going through the logs to discern that that's actually malicious traffic to Twitter versus legitimate traffic to Twitter. And since those direct messages, in the case of Twitter, for example, are HTTPS, I do not get the full URL. The only thing that I get out of the logs is that it's Twitter. So it's very hard for me to discern then if I'm using only, for example, firewall logs or proxy logs to determine that that is actually some sort of command and control type traffic because it's going to some obscure address, some sort of obscure page on Twitter. So I need something from the host side that tells me that. So I have to marry, ideally, I want to be able to marry host-based data with network-based data to be able to get an accurate read on what's going on. Because if I only have one or the other, I'm really limited. I can see something that I suspect, but I don't, if you will, have any confirming data on that. So it's very hard right now to pick that up. Again, I've got to have both sources. Just firewalls, just proxies doesn't give me enough because it's encrypted. Again, so I can't get it from the network side. I've got to have the host side to get something to that if it's being logged. And given the fact that the URL traffic is probably so high in volume, how many hosts are probably logging that? Not many. Probably about as popular as logging PowerShell at the moment. So it's difficult. It's a challenge. Getting large-scale, dirty traffic in a timely basis is a challenge. It's a challenge for all the security vendors. There are 2 large government data sets out there, but quite honestly, they're several years old now at this point. So, any other questions? Yes, please.
Any new innovative ideas in like labeling new features?
Say more, please.
Like for example, like the engram example that you get, but like any new features coming up recently that weren't there.
Oh, we're constantly trying to improve that. Constantly trying to improve that. We started with MITRE's attack ontology because it's standardized, if you will. It's open, it's free. Your tax dollars already paid for it. But we're constantly looking for new features that are out there. Now, we're somewhat constrained by what is it that the vendors actually log off of that. So we can't just invent something. If it's not in the logs, well, we can't invent it. So we're constrained by that, and constrained then again by, I won't say constrained, but it's time consuming to actually determine what the data values actually are in the logs. Some vendors are good about, if you will, describing their syslog. Okay, this is the value that means that. Other vendors, quite honestly, are just absolutely horrible about it. I don't even think that, there's a couple of them out there, I won't say who, but I don't even think they know themselves. They haven't even documented it for themselves, let alone for their customers. So that's trying to decipher the logs frankly it's a challenge for us. But if it's not in the logs, we can't use it as a feature. And even if it is in the log, sometimes is it worthwhile? You know, sometimes it's just with regards to their product's performance. Well, we don't care about their product's performance. So, but it's a good question. Thank you. Anyone else? Please.
Oh, I saw that you were using deep autocoders, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about your use case.
Give me your business card. That would be a question for my colleague who's there. I'm the security guy, not the data scientist, and he could give you a much better answer.
Yeah.
So, anything else? Okay, thank you for attending. Go grab a beer.